there are people who don't just live one life, but silently exist in two parallel worlds. And Asamoah Gyan is one of them. A man the world sees as a symbol of strength, of speed, of goals that shake stadiums. But behind the lights, behind the cheers, is another person, quiet and heavy, carrying wounds that are never fully healed. The moment at the FIFA World Cup 2010 was not just a memory, but became a long shadow cast over the rest of his life. A memory where every time he closes his eyes, he still sees the ball hitting the crossbar, still hears the terrifying silence spreading across the stadium, still feels the sensation of standing alone amid millions of expectations that had just shattered. From that day, he learned to smile when scoring, learned to celebrate in front of the cameras, but also learned to hide the pain behind his eyes, learned to keep going even though in his heart he had never truly left that moment, and that is exactly what created two people in one body, one for the world, strong and not allowed to fall, and one who only exists in silence, where he has to face his doubts, his pressures, and the questions that never have answers. But it is also from that inner conflict that his will was forged in a way no title could measure, because he not only fought opponents on the field, but also fought himself every day, continued to step onto the pitch, even knowing every run carried the weight of the past, continued to score even understanding that a single moment could erase everything, and continued to exist in the light of glory, while living with the darkness of memories that never fade. Yet if the world only saw the pain, they would have missed another important part of the story, because beside those cracks is a career that very few African players could reach. A journey built from perseverance, discipline, and an astonishing goal-scoring ability, where he became the all-time top scorer in the history of the Ghana national team, with more than 50 goals, a record that has stood through generations, where he appeared in 3 consecutive World Cups and scored a total of 6 goals, becoming the African player with the most goals in the history of this prestigious tournament, where he was a key factor in taking Ghana to the quarterfinals of the World Cup 2010, the best achievement this nation has ever had. At club level, he left his mark in Europe with Rennes and Sunderland, before entering his peak phase at Al Ain, where he scored more than 100 goals, won many domestic titles and multiple top scorer awards, becoming one of the greatest players in the history of the league, while also receiving many individual awards in Africa, including being honored multiple times as Ghana's best player and appearing in regional all-star teams. Those numbers are not just achievements, but proof of a long, stable, and influential career, where a man did not let one moment define his entire being, but continued to build a legacy big enough for the whole world to remember, not just for that shot that year, but for everything he did before and after. Before we continue, please hit like and leave a heart, as a quiet way to acknowledge the man who carried the pain of an entire continent, yet never stopped moving forward. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because ahead is a journey where you will understand that that moment was not the beginning of failure, but only a part of the life that Asamoah Gyan has had to live between two worlds for many years. After the moment when the whole world saw him as someone who had lost a historic opportunity, few remember that before becoming the Asamoah Gyan of the brightly lit stadiums, he was once just a child growing up on the dusty streets of Accra, where dreams were not nurtured by words of encouragement, but forged through harsh competition and being left behind if not strong enough. There, childhood was not peaceful afternoons or dreams told before sleep, but soccer matches played on hard ground, where every shot was not just to score, but to affirm one's existence, where, if you were just one step slower, you would be replaced by another child craving the same opportunity. And in that environment, Gyan had no choice but to learn to fight before he even understood what it meant to enjoy life. His family was no stranger to soccer, and that, instead of being a gentle support, invisibly created a wordless pressure from very early on. Because when you are born into a house where soccer is already part of your identity, you no longer have the right to choose whether you want to pursue it or not, but only the way to find out if you are good enough not to make it a burden. In that house, where every story revolved around the pitch, where matches were mentioned like milestones of life, Gian grew up with the feeling that his worth would always be measured by what he could do with the ball. And that made every step he took from very early on carry a heaviness that not every child had to bear. The influence from Asamoah Gyan was not only an inspiration but also a big shadow. Because when the older brother had already left clear footsteps on the soccer path, the younger brother behind did not simply follow, but had to prove he deserved to stand beside, not behind. In those early years, Gian did not just play soccer for fun, but played to be recognized, to not be seen as someone living off someone else's fame. And in every match, no matter how small, he always carried a silent fear that if he was not good enough today, tomorrow he would have no more chances. The street soccer matches in Accra had no spectators, no titles, but carried greater meaning than any stadium, because that was where a child's value was decided immediately, with no chance to correct mistakes, no room for weakness. There, Gian learned that if he wanted the ball passed to him, he had to prove he deserved it. If he wanted to be picked for the team, he had to play better than others, and if he wanted to survive, he was not allowed to fall even once, because just one moment of weakness and you would be replaced without anyone looking back. Those matches taught him something that later followed him throughout his career, that the world does not run on fairness, but on each person's ability to endure and persist. In that environment, Gyan had no time to learn how to live like a normal child, because every passing day was like a test where he had to prove himself strong enough to continue, good enough to be recognized, and resilient enough not to be eliminated. Small failures, criticisms, doubtful looks from those around him did not make him stop, but instead gradually formed in him a habit that later became an inseparable part of who he is. The habit of enduring in silence and carrying the pressure alone without anyone knowing. It was from those years that a second person began to form, not clearly, not named, but always present. A person who never showed weakness on the outside. A person who always tried harder than necessary to make sure he was not left behind. And even later, when he stepped onto the biggest stages, scored the most important goals, the child from back then was still there, still carrying the fear of being replaced, still carrying the feeling of having to prove himself every day, as if everything could disappear at any moment. And perhaps that is exactly what shaped Asamoah Gyan's entire life. Not the titles, not the goals, but the way he learned very early that life does not always give you a second chance. And if you want to survive, you have to fight. Not only against others, but against yourself. Every day in silence and never allowed to stop. The years in Accra not only taught Asamoah Gyan how to fight to survive, but also unintentionally placed on his shoulders something he was not old enough to fully understand. The expectations of an entire nation that always longed to see itself in the success of children like him. In Ghana, soccer is not just a sport, it is an escape. It is faith. It is the only thing that makes people living in deprivation dream of a different day, and therefore, every young player carries not only his own dream, but also the hopes that others entrust to him, hopes that are sometimes so heavy that no child can bear them. Gyan was not the only one who grew up in that situation, but there was something about him that gradually drew all eyes, from small matches to youth tournaments, from the first goals to the rare moments when he showed superior ability compared to those around him. He began to be mentioned not just as a young player, but as a name that could bring something bigger. And from that, a silent change happened. When every time he stepped onto the field, it was no longer just a match, but a promise that he would not disappoint those who believed in him. But those promises were never spoken out loud. They existed in the eyes of people standing by the roadside, in the silence of those following every run of his, in the heavy nods every time he played well, and in the cold looks when he could not do what they expected. That very silence is what made the pressure so terrifying, because no one really told him what he had to carry. But he always felt that if he was not good enough, he would become part of the disappointment this country had become too familiar with. As he progressed further, as doors began to open, as the opportunity to wear the national team jersey became clearer, the pressure did not decrease but instead became more specific, clearer, and heavier. Each match was no longer a place to learn, but a place to prove. Each touch of the ball was no longer a simple natural action, but carried the meaning of evaluation. And each goal was no longer pure joy, but a way to temporarily hold his place in the hearts of those watching. Gyan began to understand that in this country, heroes and failures are sometimes only a moment apart. That today you could be praised, but tomorrow just one small mistake, and you would be forgotten or worse, remembered as an example of not being good enough. That fear did not come from a specific event, but grew over time, seeping into every thought, every decision, making him no longer play soccer only by instinct, but with caution, as if every action could decide how an entire nation perceived him. The saddest thing is not that the pressure existed, but the way it gradually became part of who he was, to the point where he no longer recognized which were his true feelings and which were reactions formed from the fear of being judged. He learned to stay calm when scoring, learned not to show too much when winning, and also learned not to collapse when failing. Because he understood that everything was being watched, and any weakness could be interpreted as unworthiness. In that process, another person gradually formed more clearly, no longer just a vague feeling like the days on the street soccer fields, but became a real shell, a version of Gyan for the world, where he always had to be strong, always had to be stable, always had to be what others expected, even if inside he might be tired, doubting, or afraid. And the existence of those two people made him never truly live fully in any moment. Because even when he played well, he still worried about the next time, and even when he failed, he had no space to truly face it. Perhaps that is the price no one mentions before a child becomes a symbol, the price of carrying things bigger than oneself, the price of having to grow up too soon in a world that waits for no one, and the price of having to learn to keep walking, even when cracks have begun to appear inside. And for Asamoah Gyan, those cracks did not disappear over time. They only became deeper, quieter, and waited for a moment big enough to reveal themselves. A moment the whole world would see. But no one would truly understand what had led to it, leaving Ghana. Leaving the familiar streets where he once learned to fight to survive, Asamoah Gyan stepped into a completely different world, where talent was no longer enough to open doors, where every step forward had to be traded with patience and endurance, and where Europe did not welcome him as someone carrying a dream, but tested him as someone who had to prove he deserved to stay. When he set foot in Italy with Udinese, he did not step into the light of big stadiums immediately, but fell into a blurry void, where new names could easily be forgotten, if not outstanding enough, where every training session was not only an opportunity to improve, but a silent competition not to be removed from the list, and where he quickly realized that no one really cared where he came from, what story he carried, or how much he had struggled to be there. The first days passed in bewilderment, not only because of language or cultural differences, but because of the feeling of being separated from everything once familiar, when the voices around became strange, when instructions on the field were no longer easy to understand, and when the eyes looking at him were not with the expectations like in Ghana, but with quiet skepticism, as if he was just one of many young players who came and would leave without leaving a mark. Opportunities to play did not come often, and when they did, they were usually brief. Not enough for him to fully show his ability. Not enough to change how others saw him, and that created a tiring loop when he needed opportunities to prove himself, but was not given them because he had not proven anything clearly. The times coming on from the bench, the few minutes played, the matches that passed without clear imprint, all gradually accumulated into a familiar feeling. The feeling that he was there but did not really belong, that he was trying but no one really saw it. Unlike the street soccer fields in Accra, where everything was decided quickly and clearly, this environment made everything vague, where you could do well but still not be recognized, where you could make effort but still be set aside. And that very vagueness is what gradually tired him, because he no longer knew exactly what he had to do to change his position. The feeling of loneliness came not only from being far from family or homeland, but from having no one who truly understood what he was going through, no one to share with when things got hard, and nowhere to return to whenever he felt he was gradually losing faith in himself. The evenings passed in silence, the repeating thoughts about whether he was good enough or not, whether he was on the right path or not, gradually became part of a life he could not escape. Small failures began to appear. Not big falls that made everything collapse immediately, but small cracks accumulating over time. Each bad match, each missed opportunity, each time not being chosen for the starting lineup, all contributed to a silent but prolonged feeling of failure, making him gradually doubt the path he had chosen. And the scariest thing was not the failure, but that he began to get used to it, began to accept it as an inevitable part of life, as if he was not good enough to change it. Adaptation did not come as quickly as he once hoped, because it not only required skill, but also time, patience, and a faith that he sometimes was not sure he still held. He had to learn to play in a different system, understand a different style of soccer, and accept that everything would not happen the way he had imagined, that dreams were not always realized on a straight path, but often bent by unexpected challenges. Throughout that period, the second person in him became clearer, no longer just a natural reaction to pressure, but became a survival mechanism, a way for him to keep going even when he was no longer sure about the destination, a version of himself that knew how to hide fatigue, knew how to stay calm when not chosen, and knew how to keep trying without needing anyone's recognition. And perhaps that version is what helped him not collapse completely, but also made him gradually drift away from the feeling of living like a normal person, because every day that passed, he was not only playing to move forward, but also playing not to be left behind, not to be forgotten, and not to become another name that disappeared in the silence of European soccer. There are failures that come like a hard blow, making people collapse immediately, but there are also other failures, quieter, slower, seeping into each day without making noise. And that period is what tested Asamoah Gyan in the cruelest way. After the initial efforts in Europe, when the stage lights had never really shone directly on him, he gradually drifted into a gray area of his career, where he did not fail big enough to be mentioned, but also did not succeed clearly enough to be recognized, where his name existed in the team list but did not exist in the memory of fans. In the Udinese jersey and the loan spells, he was not the first name called nor the last choice eliminated. He was in the middle, in a position where anyone could replace him, a position where even the small mistake could make him disappear without leaving any clear trace. And that is exactly what made him begin to feel a different kind of pressure. Not the pressure of expectation, but the pressure of no one really expecting anything from him. The matches passed, the few minutes played, the opportunities came and went without leaving a deep enough mark, all created a chain of days repeating to the point of exhaustion, when he stepped onto the field, hoping to change something, but then left the field not sure if he had done enough or not, and worse, not sure if anyone really cared about it or not. The media did not mention him. Fans did not call his name, and in a world where attention is the measure of value, the silence became a judgment without needing to be spoken. There were evenings he returned after matches, not with a clear feeling of failure, but with a nameless emptiness, where he wondered if he was really moving forward or just standing still in a journey with no destination. Those questions had no one to answer, and gradually they no longer needed answers, because they became part of daily thoughts, sneaking into every moment, making him begin to look at himself with doubtful eyes, just like the way the world had looked at him throughout that time. Doubt about his own value did not come in one day. It accumulated from the smallest details, from not being chosen to start, from being substituted early, from seeing other players given more opportunities, and from realizing that no matter how hard he tried, his position could still be replaced by another name. And that made him gradually lose the sense of certainty a player needs, making every run no longer confident, but an effort not to make mistakes. The feeling of existing but not being recognized is one of the loneliest feelings, because it has no clear shape to fight against, no specific opponent to overcome, and no moment big enough to mark a change. It is like standing in a room full of people, but no one sees you, like speaking, but no one listens, and like trying, but no one remembers the result of those efforts. During that time, Gyan had no choice but to continue. Not because he was sure everything would get better, but because stopping meant accepting that everything he had been through was meaningless. And therefore he continued training, continued waiting, continued stepping onto the field whenever there was a chance, even though in his heart he was no longer sure those things would lead him anywhere. It was in that silence that the second person in him became stronger, not the brilliant version the world would see later, but the version that knew how to exist without needing recognition, knew how to keep himself standing even when no one was there to see, and knew how to keep believing in something he himself could not clearly explain. And perhaps that very period of being forgotten, more than any other moment, shaped Asamoah Gyan's endurance. An endurance not built from victories, but from not collapsing in the days when there seemed to be no reason to continue. But then, amid the long days that seemed would last forever in silence, another door opened. Not noisy, not dazzling, but enough to pull Asamoah Gyan out of the gray area of oblivion when he moved to Stade Rennais, an environment that did not promise miracles but gave him what he had lacked throughout the previous time: opportunity. Not a perfect opportunity, not a sure guarantee, but minutes played long enough for him to breathe, to touch the ball more, to feel that he was still a real player, not a name on the edge of the squad. The first matches here did not turn him into a star immediately, but they brought something more important: the feeling that every effort of his could finally create results, that every run no longer disappeared invisibly like before. And when the goals began to come, not in floods, but regularly enough, his name was gradually mentioned more, not as a temporary replacement, but as part of the collective, part of the story unfolding on the pitch. For many people, it was just a normal progression phase in a career. But for Gyan, it was the first time after a long period that he felt seen, recognized, mentioned. Not for where he came from, but for what he had done. Those goals not only helped the team earn points, but also, like small pieces, mending the cracks that had formed in his heart before, bringing back a feeling he had almost forgotten, the feeling of believing in himself. But along with a return of hope, something else also came back, quietly but clearly: fear. No longer the fear of being forgotten like before, but the fear of losing what had just been achieved. Each goal not only brought joy, but also brought a silent question: whether he could do it again, whether this was the beginning of a new journey, or just a short moment before everything returned to the old way. Recognition from the media and fans began to appear, but it did not bring the relief people thought, but instead made each match heavier. Because now he was not only playing to survive, but also playing to maintain the image that people were beginning to see in him. Each time he stepped onto the field, he no longer only faced opponents, but also faced the expectations that had just formed. The expectation that he would continue scoring, continue shining, continue proving that what he did was not random. That change made the feeling of safety become a luxury, because no matter how well he played, he could never be sure that his position was solid, that what he had today would still exist tomorrow. He had once been in the position of being forgotten, and that memory did not disappear just because of a few goals. It was still there, reminding him that everything could change very quickly, that just a few bad matches and all eyes could turn away, and he would return to the starting point without anyone really noticing. That feeling made every moment of success fragile, like holding something that could break at any time, and therefore he never really allowed himself to fully enjoy, never let himself sink into joy for too long, because a part of him was always preparing for the possibility that everything would collapse. And that is exactly what made him continue working more, running more, trying harder, not because he had not achieved enough, but because he did not believe what he had was enough to keep him there. In the eyes of fans, this was the phase where Asamoah Gyan began to become a notable name, a striker capable of making a difference, a player heading in the right direction. But in his own being, it was a phase full of contradictions where hope and fear existed in parallel, where every step forward came with a worry, and where the second person in him did not disappear, but only changed form, from someone trying to exist in silence to someone always vigilant about losing everything. And perhaps it was in this phase that he learned something that later followed him throughout his career, that success is not a destination that brings peace, but only a temporary state that needs to be protected, that each goal is not the final answer, but a new question, and that the road ahead, though brighter than before, is never truly safe. The World Cup 2006 did not come to Asamoah Gyan like a sudden dream, but like a door opening after many years of being tested, where for the first time he no longer stood on the edge of the story, but stepped straight into the center of the light, where all eyes began to follow every run of his on the pitch. When he scored, it was not just a simple goal, but a moment when a nation felt seen, recognized, existing in a stage they once thought was too distant. And in that second, Gyan was no longer just a player, but became the image representing faith, representing aspiration, representing everything that Ghana and all of Africa had waited for too long. His goals carried a weight that not everyone could understand, because they were not counted by numbers, but by emotions, by tears, by the cheers rising from distant streets, where people who had never set foot in a stadium still felt their hearts beat in rhythm with every play. And it was in those moments that the image of a hero began to be built, not by declarations, but by the way he appeared at the right time, did exactly what everyone hoped, and turned fragile dreams into something touchable. But when someone is called a hero, that not only brings honor, but also carries a price few see. Because from that point on, Gyan was no longer allowed to just be himself. He no longer had the right to make mistakes like a normal player, no longer had space to experiment, to learn, to fail, and stand up naturally. Because every mistake now was not just a personal mistake, but could become the disappointment of millions of people placing their faith in him. Expectations from fans rose not step by step, but moment by moment, and each goal raised the standard he had to maintain, making becoming better no longer a goal, but an obligation he could not refuse. Each time he stepped onto the field, he carried not only his boots and the ball, but also the looks, the hopes, the dreams of people who believed he would continue to take them further, and that made each match heavier, each decision harder, and each moment more fragile. There was no longer space for mistakes, because mistakes were no longer seen as part of the journey, but as a betrayal of the faith that had been given. And that is exactly what made Gyan begin to play soccer in a different way, no longer completely free like the days in Accra, no longer relying only on instinct and joy, but always having a part of him calculating, being cautious, trying to ensure he did not do anything that could break the image others had placed on him. And in that process, soccer gradually changed its meaning from a place to express oneself to a place to meet expectations. Responsibility began to replace the feeling of freedom, and that did not happen in one moment, but happened gradually, through each match, each tournament, each time he was called a hope, until he realized that he was no longer playing soccer just for himself, but for everything others saw in him. The second person in him, which had formed from the difficult years before, now not only existed to help him endure, but became an indispensable part so he could continue standing firm in his new role, the role of a hero not allowed to be weak, but deep inside, the child who once ran on the dusty streets of Accra was still there, still remembered the feeling of playing soccer without anyone judging, still longed for a moment where he could make a mistake without being remembered forever, and the parallel existence of those two people made each step of Gyan more complicated. When every success came with a worry and every time he was praised made him drift a little further from himself. The World Cup 2006 created a hero, but also began a journey in which Asamoah Gyan had to learn to live with a version of himself that he did not fully choose, a version built from expectations, from pressure, and from a belief that he had to continue, even if inside he might have begun to tire. Because stopping was not just stopping for himself, but stopping for all those who had believed he would never stop. And then, everything that had accumulated throughout those years, from childhood in Accra, the days of being forgotten in Europe, to the pressure of becoming a hero after the FIFA World Cup 2006, finally converged into a single moment. A moment that later not only defined the career of Asamoah Gyan, but also haunted him throughout the rest of his life. The match against Uruguay at the FIFA World Cup 2010 was not just a quarter-final, but an opportunity that African soccer had never had before. An opportunity to step into the World Cup semi-finals. For the first time in history, a team from this continent could stand alongside the soccer powerhouses. And in that moment, Gyan did not just represent Ghana, but represented a dream that had stretched across many generations. The match was tense. Every play carried the weight of history. And as time drifted toward the final seconds of extra time, when the score was still undecided, an unexpected opportunity appeared, a situation that in a split second changed everything. When the ball hit the hand of a Uruguayan player right on the goal line, a decision was made, a red card, and a penalty awarded to Ghana, as if fate had opened one final door. In that moment, the entire stadium fell silent, not because of a lack of sound, but because every emotion condensed into one heavy, indescribable mass. And amid it all, Gyan stepped up, slowly. No one said anything. No one could share that burden, because it was a moment that only he himself had to face. The seconds before the shot seemed to stretch endlessly in his mind. No longer just a few simple steps, but an entire journey rewound from the days when he was still a child on the dirt soccer field, the times of being forgotten, the moments of recognition, all piling up in a short but heavy period of time that made it hard to breathe. And in his eyes at that time, there was not only the goal in front, but also millions of people placing their faith in that shot. When he took the shot, there was no clear hesitation, no sign of fear that outsiders could see. But inside, it was the intersection of everything he had carried throughout his life. And then the ball flew up, hit the crossbar, bounced out. A dry sound rang out, not loud, but enough to shatter everything that had just been built. In a split second, the dream ended, not with a loss, but with an emptiness, a silence spreading across the stadium where no one truly understood what had just happened. But everyone felt that something had been lost. Gyan stood there, not collapsing immediately, not reacting violently, just standing still, as if his body had not yet realized that the moment that had just passed had changed everything. And that very silence was the most painful thing because it gave him no way to release, no chance to go back, only leaving a memory that would repeat in his head for many years afterward. After the match, the world continued to move. Other stories emerged, other tournaments began, but for Gyan, that moment never really ended. It was not only in the past, but existed in his present, in his interrupted sleeps, in the times he closed his eyes and saw the ball flying up, then bouncing out, in the times people retold the story as part of soccer history, without knowing that for him it was not a story, but a wound that had never closed. What made this moment cruel was not only the result, but the way it clung tightly to who he was, making every success afterward have to go through that memory, making every goal unable to be completely separated from that shot that year, and making his image in the eyes of many people always divided between a hero who had taken Ghana far and one who had missed the biggest opportunity. And that very division reflected what had existed in him for a very long time, a life with two parallel people, one person standing under the lights, continuing to play, continuing to score, continuing to smile, and another person, quieter, heavier, still standing forever at the penalty spot in 2010, never truly leaving. After that night, when the final whistle sounded, and the images of the match were gradually replaced by new stories, the soccer world did not stop. The media moved on to other focuses, other tournaments, other stars, and for most fans, that moment gradually became a memory recalled over time. A video clip, a historic story, but for Asamoah Gyan, it was not a memory that could be put behind, but a part of the present, a part that he carried with every run, with every time he stepped onto the field, like a sound that never completely faded, sometimes clear, sometimes faint, but never entirely gone. As the tournaments continued, as he returned to the club, as new matches began, from the outside looking in, everything seemed to proceed normally. He still trained, still played, still scored, still did what a striker was expected to do, and if only looking at the numbers, people might believe that he had moved past that moment, that he had returned to himself. But what happened inside was completely different. Because there are wounds that cannot be measured by achievements, and there are memories that cannot be erased by time. Each time he stepped into a new match, even if no one mentioned it, he still carried the feeling of that penalty spot from that year. Not always clearly, but enough to affect the way he perceived everything. Enough to make every scoring opportunity heavier, because in some corner of his mind, there always existed the question of what if he failed this time too? What if another moment became a memory he could not escape? The media, although it had moved on to other stories, occasionally returned to that moment, especially whenever there was a major tournament, whenever Ghana played, whenever people wanted to recall memorable moments of African soccer, and each time like that, the story was retold, the images were replayed, and for the audience, it was just part of history. But for Gyan, it was reliving the same emotion, the same moment, as if time had not passed at all. Questions from the press, interviews, comments from fans, although carrying different meanings, still unintentionally kept that memory always present, not giving it a chance to settle completely. And that made him have to learn how to answer, learn how to smile, learn how to talk about it as part of his career, even though inside, the feeling had never become lighter. On the outside, his image remained stable, still a professional player. Someone who had gone through ups and downs and continued to stand firm. Someone many people looked at and saw resilience. But inside, it was a completely different state, where every memory had weight, where every recollection carried a feeling that had not been released, and where he had to handle those emotions by himself that no one really saw. That very difference between the two images made his life more complicated, when one part of him had to maintain stability to continue his career, to meet expectations, to not let the past affect the present too clearly, while the other part remained stuck in a moment he could not change, could not fix, and could not forget. The existence of those two parallel states was no longer vague like before, but became clearer than ever. One state for the world, where he was Asamoah Gyan of the goals, of the matches, of the numbers, and another state where he was just a person trying to understand and accept a part of his life that he could not redo. There were days when he could step onto the field and feel completely focused, completely present, but there were also moments, even very brief, when a similar situation appeared, a penalty, a decisive opportunity, and in a split second, the old memory returned, without invitation, without warning, simply appearing and reminding him of what had happened. And those very moments made him realize that there were things that could not leave him, no matter how far he continued to move forward. The world might have moved on, but for Asamoah Gyan, a part of him remained there, not because he did not want to move forward, but because there were moments strong enough to become part of who he was, not like a burden that could be put down, but like a mark that could not be erased. And the only thing he could do was learn to live with it. Continue playing, continue existing, continue being the person everyone saw, while accepting that inside him there was always a part that had never left that night. After everything that had happened, when the memory was still there as an inseparable part, Asamoah Gyan entered a phase where, from the outside looking in, everything finally seemed more stable. When he moved to Al Ain, a completely different environment from Europe, where media pressure was no longer too harsh, where expectations were not global, and where he could play at a different pace, less intense, less judgmental. Here, the goals began to come regularly, no longer rare moments like before, but became a familiar part in every match, when he scored continuously, becoming one of the most effective strikers in the league, helping the team win titles, and gradually building a new image, an image of stability, of certainty, of a player who always knew how to find the goal. Success here was not random, but the result of everything he had accumulated over many years, from skill, experience, to the ability to endure pressure, and in a less harsh environment. Those qualities had space to show more clearly, helping him become the center of the team, become the name that fans here trusted, and become one of the most notable players in the league. Along with the goals, financial stability and fame also came. No longer days of worrying about position, no longer periods of being forgotten, but a life with a clearer structure, where he knew he would step onto the field, knew he would be given opportunities, and knew that what he did would be recognized. For many people, this was a well-deserved reward for the years he had gone through, an ideal destination after the ups and downs, a place where a player could enjoy the fruits of his labor. But right in that stability, another feeling gradually appeared, not clear from the beginning, but enough to make him think. The feeling that he was moving away from something, not just the geographical distance from Europe, but the distance from the biggest stages of soccer, where every match carried special meaning, where every goal could change the way the whole world perceived you. At Al Ain, he still scored, still won, but those moments no longer carried the same weight as before. No longer the feeling that he was participating in the biggest stories of soccer, but like standing in a separate space where everything happened fully but was not completely connected to the rest of the world. The feeling of moving away from pressure initially brought a certain relief, when he no longer had to face constant scrutiny, no longer had to live under overly harsh lights, and no longer had to answer the repeating questions about the past. But along with that, he also realized that pressure, although heavy, had once been a part that made him feel he was moving forward, heading toward a bigger goal. And when the pressure decreased, a part of the motivation also gradually changed, not disappearing, but no longer the same as before. Success in this phase did not bring the complete feeling he once thought, because it was no longer tied to overcoming the biggest limits, no longer proving himself at the highest level, but like a prolonged state of stability, where everything happened as predicted, where he did his job well, but did not feel he was reaching something far beyond. And that is exactly what made him begin to look back, not with clear regret, but with a feeling hard to name, as if a part of the journey had been left behind. a part he was not sure if he still had the chance to return to or not. The second person in him, which had existed for a long time, now appeared in a different way, no longer just enduring pressure or memories, but the awareness of the gap between what he had and what he had once pursued, a silence that did not come from direct pain, but from understanding that success did not always bring a feeling of completion, that there were phases in life where you achieved many things, but still felt missing something that could not be described. And while the world looked in and saw a successful, stable Asamoah Gyan who continued to make his mark, inside, he still continued to live between two states, one state of the numbers, of the titles, of the goals that were recorded, and another state where he wondered about the meaning of all those things, where he faced the feeling that even though he had come very far, there were still parts of the journey he would never truly complete. Amid all the changes in his career, amid the goals, the titles, and even the unnamed silences, Asamoah Gyan still kept for himself another space, a place that seemed unaffected by the stadium lights. That was family, where he had a wife, had children, had evenings without cheers, without pressure from the stands, and from the outside looking in, it was a complete picture, a life that many believed had achieved the balance that a professional player always sought. In the rare moments he appeared in public with his family, he came across as a calm, responsible man, a father, a husband, an image completely different from what happened on the pitch, and that very contrast made many people believe that at least in this aspect, he had found the stability that soccer life did not always provide. But just like other parts of his life, that stability was not entirely simple as what outsiders saw, because behind those peaceful images were silences that no one really heard, thoughts that he did not easily share, and pressures that he had long been used to keeping to himself from very early on. The habit of enduring in silence, formed from his childhood years and reinforced through each phase of his career, did not disappear when he entered family life, but followed him into the space that seemed the safest, making sharing more difficult, not because there was no one to talk to, but because he did not know how to express what he was carrying. His family life, for many years, maintained a rare privacy in the world of celebrities, with no noisy stories, no public disputes, and that made his image even more stable in the eyes of fans, like someone who had avoided the incidents that many others could not avoid. But that very privacy also meant that what happened inside was never seen, never fully understood, and sometimes the prolonged silence was not a sign of peace, but a sign of things that had not been resolved. Personal pressure, which had existed in him for a very long time, did not disappear when he returned home after each match, but only changed form. From the pressure to score, to win, to the pressure to maintain an image, to keep everything stable, to ensure that those around him were not affected by what he was going through. And in that process, he gradually got used to keeping his emotions to himself, not letting them spread, not letting them disturb the life he had tried to build. But that very thing also made the distance between him and those closest to him become hard to notice. Not a clear distance, but a quiet estrangement that accumulated over time. Conversations became shorter, thoughts were kept more, and unnamed emotions gradually formed a barrier that no one actively created, but no one knew how to break. From the outside, everything still operated normally. The family was still there. Life continued, but inside, there were parts that no longer connected as before, not because of a lack of affection, but because of a lack of sharing, a lack of moments where the real person could appear without having to maintain an image. Perhaps the hardest thing was not facing pressure from the outside world, but carrying those pressures into the private space without a way to release them. Because when someone had gotten used to enduring alone, they would continue to do so even when it was not necessary, and that made them gradually become distant even from the people they loved the most. Gyan was not someone who did not care about family. On the contrary, precisely because he cared, He wanted even more to keep everything from being affected. But in that effort, he unintentionally created a gap that was not easy to fill. Those distances did not appear immediately. There was no specific moment that marked the change, but they formed day by day through each time not speaking out, through each time choosing silence instead of sharing, and over time, they became part of life, a part that from the outside no one saw, but inside was clearly felt. And just like other parts in the life of Asamoah Gyan, this was also where the two people in him continued to exist in parallel. One person keeping the role of a husband, a father, a stable and reliable image, and another person still carrying thoughts, pressures, and unanswered questions existing in silence, even when among the closest people. And then, when the silences in the family were still there, when everything from the outside still maintained the familiar, stable appearance, a decision was made that caused everything that had been kept secret to begin to come to light. Not through a noisy explosion, but through a silence heavier than any argument. When Asamoah Gyan decided to request a DNA test for his children, an action that for many people might only be a procedure, but in the context of a family, it carried much deeper meaning, because it touched the most basic thing of trust. Something that once questioned would never be intact as before. No one knew exactly which moment made that thought form. There was no single event pointed out as the cause, but like many other things in his life, it came from accumulation, from small doubts that were not resolved, from distances that had existed before, and from an inner state that he had gotten used to keeping to himself, where questions without clear answers gradually grew larger over time. That decision, when made, did not only take place in private space, but quickly became the focus of attention from the media, because the name Asamoah Gyan was no longer only attached to soccer, but attached to a highly sensitive personal story, a story that the public always tended to follow, analyze, and sometimes judge without truly understanding everything happening behind the scenes. Articles appeared, comments spread widely, speculations followed one after another, and in a short time, his private life was no longer his own, but became a public story, where every detail was scrutinized, every action was interpreted in many different ways. When the test results were announced, confirming that his children were indeed his biological children, legally and in reality, the story could be considered to have a clear conclusion. A conclusion that many people might see as the end of all doubts. But for those inside the story, it was not the ending point, but just another milestone in a process whose consequences could not be measured by a test result. Trust, once questioned, could not return intact just because of an accurate answer, because what was damaged was not only the truth, but the feeling of certainty, of connection, of knowing that the people beside him truly stood on the same side, and when that was shaken, even when the truth was confirmed, the cracks were still there, not clear, but present, not noisy, but deep. For Gyan, this was not just a family incident, but also a direct collision with the image he had built in the eyes of the public for many years. An image of stability, of a responsible man, of someone who had overcome many difficulties to achieve success, and in that moment, everything belonging to private life suddenly became part of the public story, where he no longer controlled how others perceived him. Criticisms appeared, conflicting opinions spread, and even though there were people who understood and sympathized, there were still quite a few who looked at this story as a mistake, a difficult-to-accept decision, and that made his image more complicated in the eyes of the public. No longer a clear, straight line, but a collection of many different layers, where success and controversy existed at the same time. But perhaps the deepest impact did not lie in what others said, but in what happened inside, where he had to face the consequences of his own decision, had to see what had changed in the family, had to feel the distance that had existed before and now became clearer, and had to accept that there were things, once they happened, that could not return to the way they were. The second person in him, which had long been used to enduring in silence, now appeared once again, but no longer just to face pressure from the outside, but to handle an incident coming from inside his personal life, an incident with no stadium, no final whistle, and no chance to redo. The days after that passed not through matches or goals, but through thoughts, questions, and emotions that were not easy to name. As he continued his life, continued appearing in public, continued maintaining what needed to be maintained, but inside, clearly understanding that a part of his life had changed, not in a way that outsiders could easily recognize, but in a way that only those inside could truly feel. A change that was not noisy, but deep enough to remain long after all the attention had gradually subsided. And then, after everything that had happened, after the stories gradually settled down in the newspapers and the public's attention shifted, Asamoah Gyan stood before a choice that perhaps he had never thought about in the early years of his career. That was to step away from the very things that had once defined him, not because he no longer had the ability, but because he no longer had enough strength to continue carrying everything that came with it. The decision to retire from the national team at a certain stage was not only a professional move, but a natural response of a person who had endured too much pressure for a long time. A way to temporarily set down what had become too heavy. The Ghana national team was not just a place where he played, but a place where he became a symbol, a place where he was tied to the greatest expectations, and also a place that held the most unforgettable memories, both good and bad. So leaving it, even for a period of time, felt like stepping out of a part of himself, a part he had been attached to for many years, but also the part that tired him the most. When he no longer appeared regularly on the international pitch, when he no longer had to answer the repeating questions from the media, when he no longer had to face the evaluating looks from millions of people, a rare silence appeared in his life. A silence that initially brought a feeling of relief, as if he could finally breathe without carrying an invisible burden. He began to stay away from the media, not because he wanted to hide anything, but because he no longer had enough energy to keep explaining, to keep facing questions whose answers would never satisfy everyone. And in that silence, he found a personal space where he did not need to play any role, did not need to maintain an image, did not need to prove anything to anyone except himself. That time of living separately was not a complete withdrawal from life, but a slow process of looking back, of understanding more clearly what had happened, and of asking himself what all the things he had been through really meant. With no more packed match schedules, no more continuous flights, no more press conferences, he had more time to be alone with his thoughts, and it was in those moments that the questions he previously had no time to face began to become clearer. He looked back at his career, not only through the numbers or titles, but through the emotions, the choices, the moments that had shaped who he was, and realized that there were things he had done out of passion, things he had done out of responsibility, and things he had done only because he felt he had no other choice. That distinction was not easy, because for a long time everything seemed to blend together. But with distance, when he was no longer caught in the continuous flow of soccer, he began to see more clearly what had truly belonged to him and what was only the result of external pressure. Along with that reflection came another feeling, an uncomfortable feeling, the feeling of being lost, when the things that had once defined his life no longer existed with the same intensity as before, when he no longer had to prepare for the next match, no longer had to think about the next opponent, and no longer had to prove himself in every moment. That emptiness, although necessary, brought with it a void that he could not immediately fill, because for many years his life had always had a clear goal, a specific direction, and when that temporarily disappeared, finding meaning in ordinary things became harder than he had thought. The second person in him, who had grown used to enduring and continuing, now had to face a different challenge. Not pressure from the outside, but the silence from within, where there was no more noise to cover up thoughts, where he had to face himself directly, what he had been through, what he had lost, and what he still had. And perhaps this very phase, although not seen as much as the moments on the pitch, was one of the most important phases in the life of Asamoah Gyan because this was when he no longer ran after anything, but began to learn how to stand still, look at himself, and accept that there were answers that would never come. But life still had to continue, even in a different way. Slower, quieter, and less certain than before, when the silence gradually became a familiar part, when the thoughts were no longer as chaotic as before. Asamoah Gyan entered the final phase of his career with a different mindset, no longer the person running forward with all speed and desire, like in the early years, but a person who slowed down, observed more, and felt more clearly every change happening within himself. His form was no longer at its peak. His runs were no longer explosive like before, and the matches no longer brought the feeling he had once been familiar with. Not because he no longer tried, but because time, something no one could fight against, had begun to leave clear traces on his body and in the way he played. He was no longer the center of every team he wore the jersey for, no longer the first name mentioned in the lineup, and no longer the player around whom every tactic revolved. Instead, he became part of the collective in a different way. Less prominent, less noticed, but still present, still contributing, and still holding a certain position based on experience and what he had built before. That change was not easy to accept, not because he did not understand that it was inevitable, but because it forced him to face a reality that the things that had once defined him were gradually moving away, that the things that had once been his strengths were now no longer enough to keep him in his old position, and that letting go was not a decision, but a process that happened little by little, through each match, each time he was not chosen, each moment of realizing that he was no longer the version of himself as before. The memories, especially the memories that had shaped his career, did not disappear over time, but remained there, like inseparable pieces, sometimes clear, sometimes just appearing briefly, but enough to remind him of the path he had walked. The moment in 2010, the goals, the times he was praised, all existed in parallel, none completely overshadowing the other, and that very existence made him unable to look back at the past in the simple way, unable to call it success or failure clearly, but only able to accept that it was a part of him, whether he wanted it or not. Acceptance did not come immediately. It was not a decision made in one day, but the result of many thoughts, many times facing himself, many times realizing that there was no way to go back and change what had happened, and that continuing to live with those memories was the only thing he could do. He began to see the difficult moments not only as mistakes, but as experiences that had contributed to creating the person he was now, not to justify, but to understand that every step, whether right or wrong, had a place in his story. In that process, he learned to let go of the things he had previously tried to hold on to, not letting go of the memories, but letting go of the way he blamed himself for them, letting go of the need to explain everything to others, and letting go of the desire to be perceived in a certain way. That did not change the past, but made the present lighter, enough for him to continue without being pulled back too much by what had passed. Life, in this phase, no longer revolved around soccer as before, but expanded to other things, smaller things, more ordinary things, but bringing a feeling he had not clearly felt in many years, the feeling of existing without needing to prove anything, of being with family without having to carry the role of a hero, and of being himself without needing to split into two people like before. That did not mean the pressures had completely disappeared, or the memories no longer had influence, but the way he faced them had changed, no longer resisting, no longer trying to push them away, but accepting that they would always be there and learning to live with them instead of letting them define his entire being. The second person in him, who had existed for many years as a protective shell, now no longer needed to tense up like before, no longer needed to hide too much, because the gap between the two versions gradually narrowed, not by erasing one of them, but by letting them exist together more naturally, like two parts of a person who had been through more than others could see. And in that slowing down, in accepting what could not be changed, Asamoah Gyan began to learn something that was perhaps more important than any goal. That was the way to continue life, not by running faster, but by understanding more clearly where he was going, not by forgetting the past, but by carrying it without letting it become a burden, and not by returning to the center position, but by finding meaning even when he was no longer there. When everything gradually settled, when the years of playing were no longer the center of life, the journey of Asamoah Gyan began to appear more clearly like a complete picture, no longer covered by the pressure of each match or the judgment of each moment, but seen as a long flow of efforts, stumbles, and times of standing up that not everyone saw. From a boy in Accra, where every street soccer match was a battle for survival, to a player stepping onto the biggest stage of world soccer, that journey did not follow a straight line, but was full of turns, breaks, and silences whose meaning only he himself understood. Throughout his career, he had left his mark not only with goals, but with rare perseverance. When he became the all-time top scorer in the history of the Ghana national team, a record that was not just numbers, but proof of a long journey tied to the national jersey, where each time he stepped onto the field was not just a match, but a time of carrying the faith of an entire country. He was also the African player with the most goals in World Cups, an achievement that placed him in a special position in soccer history, not just because of the number of goals, but because of what those goals represented. The moments when he had brought hope to millions of people, and the memories that, whether joyful or painful, could not be separated from the story of African soccer. But if only looking at those numbers, people would see only part of the story, because behind the records and titles was a person who had to live in the inner conflict between two images. One image of a hero, strong, decisive, always ready to step up in important moments, and another image, more ordinary, more fragile, where he had to face doubts, pressures, and memories that no one could share in his place. Those two people did not exist separately, but always walked side by side, influencing each other. When one side was nurtured by victories and recognition, while the other was formed from failures and silences, and that very simultaneous existence made his life more complicated, unable to be summarized in a simple story of success or failure. There were moments when fans saw him as a symbol, a name tied to national pride. But there were also moments when he was just a man trying to understand and accept what had happened in his life, not by forgetting, but by learning to live with them, carrying them without letting them stop him from continuing to move forward. The legacy he left was not only in the goals or titles, but in the way he had existed in a world that was not easy, in the way he continued to play after the most difficult moments, and in the way he did not let a single moment define his entire being, even knowing that the world might always remember it more than anything else. For Ghana soccer, he was not just a player, but a part of history, a part of the memories that fans would retell through generations. Not because everything was perfect, but because they were real, because they reflected exactly what soccer could bring, both joy and pain. And for those who followed him, the story of Asamoah Gyan was not just a story about a career, but a story about a person who had to carry more than what others saw, who had to live between two worlds for a long time, and who had learned to accept that as an unchangeable part of himself. His life was not perfect. It was not a series of consecutive victories. It was not a journey without mistakes. But those very imperfections made the story more real, closer, and more meaningful, because it showed that the value of a person does not lie only in what they achieve, but in the way they continue after everything does not go as expected. And even as time passes, even as the matches have faded into the past, the image of Asamoah Gyan will still exist, not just as a player who scored many goals, but as a person who never stopped, a person who carried his burden through every phase of life, not to escape it, but to live with it, and to continue moving forward, even though the road ahead was no longer as clear as before, but it was still the road he chose to walk, step by step, in silence, but full of meaning. The story of Asamoah Gyan leaves a feeling that is both heartbreaking and admirable, because it is not the journey of someone who always won, but the journey of a person who had to carry wounds that never truly healed but still continued to move forward. From the moment the penalty at the FIFA World Cup 2010 hit the crossbar, where an entire continent placed its faith and then collapsed in silence, to the years afterward when he still stepped onto the field, still scored, but inside was always pulled back by the memory, we clearly see a painful truth that there are failures that never end. They only change the way they exist in a person. And when looking at the phase when he succeeded at Alain with hundreds of goals and financial stability, we again see another paradox. Success does not always bring healing, because he still felt he was moving away from the biggest stages, away from the original dream. Even in family life, where it seemed like a support, the decision to do the DNA test also showed a person who had grown used to living in doubt and pressure to the point of bringing it into even private relationships, creating distances that could not be easily mended. What makes this story special is not the goal records for Ghana or individual titles, but the way he continued to live when everything was no longer perfect, when he had to accept that he could not rewrite the past, but still had to live on with it. For American audiences, where success is often measured by victories and perfect images, this story is a profound reminder that the true value of a person does not lie in avoiding failure, but in the way they face it. That strength is not about not falling, but about still standing up and continuing, even when it still hurts inside. And that sometimes the most honorable thing is not the moment of victory, but the quiet perseverance after all the lights have gone out. If the story of Asamoah Gyan makes you feel the weight of the things no one sees, please hit subscribe and leave a heart as a word of gratitude for a person who never stopped moving forward despite carrying so much. Thank you for listening, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that the world often forgets.